When the billionaire told me to stay in the kitchen because women like me don't understand business, he didn't expect me to correct his speech in perfect English in front of his investors. At that moment, his face went pale. What he didn't know is that I had 3 degrees and spoke 5 languages. But what happened after that changed everything forever. I arrived in the United States 10 years ago with nothing but a suitcase and a dream that felt too big for my hands. The airport smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. I remember standing in line at customs, my palms sweating against my passport, watching families reunite with tears and laughter while I stood there alone, 25 years old, with a college degree that suddenly felt worthless the moment I crossed the border. My mother had sold her car to help pay for my ticket. My father worked double shifts for 6 months, and here I was, ready to make it all mean something. The first year was brutal. I cleaned houses during the day and offices at night. My hands cracked from chemicals. My back ached from bending over toilets that belonged to people who never looked me in the eye. I had a degree in business administration from one of the top universities in Colombia and a master's in finance, but none of that mattered here. Every job application I sent was met with silence or rejection. They saw my name, Maria Alejandra Restrepo, and made assumptions before I even walked through the door. So I cleaned, I scrubbed, I made myself invisible because being invisible was the only way I could survive. I lived in a shared apartment in Queens with 4 other women, all of us from different parts of Latin America, all of us overqualified and underpaid. We spoke in whispers about our old lives, about the careers we left behind, the respect we used to have. At night, I studied English through online courses, perfecting every pronunciation, every idiom, every nuance. I wanted to sound like I belonged here, even if no one believed I did. By my second year, I spoke English better than most native speakers I encountered. I also taught myself French and brushed up on my German and Portuguese. Languages were my rebellion, my secret weapon. The agency called me on a Tuesday morning. They had a position available at a private residence in Manhattan, a live-out housekeeper for a wealthy family. The pay was decent, better than what I was making, and the hours were predictable. I said yes before they finished the sentence. I didn't ask questions. I couldn't afford to. The address they gave me was on the Upper East Side, one of those buildings with a doorman who wore white gloves and looked at you like you were dirt on his shoe. I walked through the service entrance, of course. People like me didn't use the front door. The penthouse belonged to Marcus Thornton. I'd heard the name before, seen it in financial magazines at the library where I sometimes studied. He was a billionaire, a tech investor, someone who built his empire by acquiring struggling companies and flipping them for profit. He was in his early 50s, tall with graying hair, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. His wife had left him 2 years earlier, and he lived alone in that massive space surrounded by modern art. He probably didn't understand and furniture that looked uncomfortable on purpose. Marcus barely acknowledged me the first day. He was on a phone call when I arrived, pacing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, gesturing wildly as he barked orders at someone on the other end. The housekeeper who trained me, an older Polish woman named Kasia, whispered as she showed me around. "He doesn't like to be disturbed. Stay quiet. Do your job. Don't ask questions. He'll never learn your name, and that's fine. That's how it works here." I nodded. I understood. I'd been playing this role for years. At first, it was just another job. I dusted his bookshelves, polished the marble countertops, restocked his bar with expensive whiskey I'd never be able to afford. But I started noticing things. Papers left out on his desk, printouts of presentations filled with typos and grammatical errors, financial reports with miscalculated figures, draft emails that read like they'd been written by someone who barely passed high school English. It shocked me. Here was a man who controlled millions of dollars, who made decisions that affected thousands of lives, and he couldn't construct a proper sentence or calculate a basic profit margin. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my place. I was the help. The Colombian woman who scrubbed his floors and made sure his coffee was hot every morning at 7. He had an assistant, a sharp young man named Brad, who wore designer suit and carried himself like he was destined for greatness. Brad looked through me like I was a piece of furniture. Once, I overheard Marcus and Brad talking in the kitchen while I cleaned the study. Marcus was complaining about his upcoming presentation to a group of European investors. This deal could change everything, Brad. $200 million. But these guys are tough. They won't tolerate any mistakes. Brad reassured him. You'll be fine, boss. Just stick to the script. But I'd seen the script. It was a disaster. My double life began out of necessity. I couldn't survive on a housekeeper's salary alone, not if I wanted to send money home and save for the future I still believed in. So at night, after my shifts, I worked as a freelance financial consultant under the name A.M. Rivera. I created a simple website, listed my credentials, and started taking on small clients who needed help with business plans, investment strategies, market analysis. No one knew I was the same woman who cleaned their offices during the day. Online, I was just another consultant with impeccable credentials and a sharp mind. The work was steady, the pay was decent, and it kept my skills from rotting away in a bucket of bleach. The irony wasn't lost on me. During the day, I'd overhear Marcus making questionable financial decisions, throwing around terms he didn't fully understand, while at night, I advised clients on the exact same strategies he should have been using. I started keeping notes, not to use against him, but because I couldn't help myself. It was like watching someone cook a meal wrong when you know exactly how to fix it. The urge to intervene was overwhelming, but I stayed silent and invisible, just like I was supposed to be. Then came the comments. Marcus hosted dinner parties occasionally, usually small gatherings of business associates and wealthy friends. I served drinks, cleared plates, refilled wine glasses, and listened to conversations I wasn't supposed to understand. One evening, a guest made a joke about immigrants taking American jobs. Marcos laughed and said, "Well, at least they're good at cleaning." Everyone chuckled. I stood 3 feet away, holding a tray of empty glasses, my face neutral, my heart burning. Another time, Brad asked Marcus if he'd checked my references carefully. "You know how these agencies are. They'll send anyone." Marcus waved him off. "She's fine. She doesn't talk much. That's all I need." As if my silence was a feature, not a consequence of their contempt. The worst part was Thanksgiving. Marcus hosted a small gathering, and I worked overtime to prepare everything. I marinated the turkey, made the sides from scratch, set the table with his expensive china. When the guests arrived, one of them, a loud man with a red face and too much cologne, asked Marcus where he found such good help. Marcus shrugged and said, "The agency sends them. I think she's from Mexico or something." I'm Colombian, I thought, but I didn't correct him. What was the point? To him, we were all the same, interchangeable, forgettable. But the moment that broke something inside me happened 3 weeks before the night that changed everything. I was vacuuming the hallway when Marcus walked out of his office with Brad. They were discussing the upcoming investor meeting, the one that would determine the future of Marcus's latest acquisition. Brad mentioned that the presentation needed to be flawless. These guys don't mess around. They're Europeans, old money. They expect precision. Marcus laughed nervously. "I've got this. I've been preparing for weeks." Then he saw me and stopped. "Hey, you." He didn't know my name. He'd never asked. "Can you get us some coffee?" I nodded and went to the kitchen. As I prepared their drinks, I heard Marcus say, "Thank God she doesn't understand half of what we're talking about." Can you imagine if the help knew how much money was on the table? Brad laughed. "She probably thinks $1 million is like winning the lottery." They both found this hilarious. That night, I went home and cried for the first time in years, not because I was hurt, though I was, but because I was tired of being underestimated, tired of pretending I was less than I was, tired of watching mediocre men stumble through opportunities I would have crushed if anyone had given me the chance. I looked at myself in the mirror and made a decision. I didn't know what it would look like yet, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible, ever been dismissed because of where you're from or how you look, leave the word resilience in the comments. I want to know I'm not alone. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss what happens next. The investor dinner was scheduled for a Friday evening in mid-November. Marcus had been a nervous wreck all week. He snapped at Brad over minor details, rewrote the presentation a dozen times, and paced the penthouse like a caged animal. I watched him unravel from the margins, still invisible, still silent. The stakes were enormous. Marcus was trying to secure $200 million to expand his latest acquisition, a tech startup that, from what I'd overheard, was bleeding money faster than he realized. The European investors, a consortium led by a French billionaire named Philippe Laurent, were notoriously difficult. They didn't invest based on charm or potential. They wanted numbers, strategy, proof. The morning of the dinner, Marcus was practically vibrating with anxiety. He stood in the living room rehearsing his speech while I dusted the shelves nearby. I tried not to listen, but it was impossible. Every other sentence contained a grammatical error. He mispronounced financial terms. He referenced data that I knew, from the reports I'd seen on his desk, was outdated or just plain wrong. At one point, he said, "Our quarterly projections has exceeded expectations, has not have." I clenched my jaw and kept dusting. He continued, "We're positioned to dominate the market, leveraging our core competencies to maximize stakeholder value." It sounded impressive, but it was corporate jargon without substance. The numbers didn't support his claims. If he presented this to serious investors, they'd tear him apart. Brad arrived around noon to help with final preparations. They went over the presentation again, and I heard Brad say, "It's good, Marcus, really good. You're going to kill it." I wanted to scream, "No, it's not good. It's a disaster." But I said nothing. I finished my tasks and moved to the kitchen to prepare the dinner. Marcus had hired a catering company for the main courses, but I was responsible for setting the table, arranging the flowers, making sure every detail was perfect. The penthouse had to look flawless. Image was everything to Marcus, even if the substance was lacking. The guests arrived at 7. Philippe Laurent was a slim man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He brought 2 colleagues, both impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from old money. Marcus greeted them with exaggerated warmth, shaking hands, offering drinks, playing the gracious host. I moved through the room like a ghost, refilling glasses, clearing plates, blending into the background. They spoke in English, though occasionally Philippe and his colleagues switched to French, probably assuming no one else in the room understood. I understood every word. They were skeptical. One of them whispered to Philippe, "I don't know about this one." "He seems desperate," Philippe replied. "We'll see. The numbers will tell us everything." Dinner was served, and the conversation was polite but probing. Philippe asked pointed questions about market trends, revenue projections, risk management. Marcos answered confidently, but I could hear the cracks in his responses. He was winging it, relying on charisma instead of data. After dessert, Marcus stood to give his formal presentation. He'd set up a projector in the dining room, and his slides appeared on the wall. He began speaking, his voice steady at first, but within minutes I could see Philippe's expression shift from polite interest to barely concealed skepticism. I was in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, when I heard Marcus say, "Our competitive strategy ensures that we maintain an advantage over our competitors. An advantage." My hands froze on the plate I was holding. Then he said, "The data shows that we has captured 30% of the market share. Has. Again." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. This wasn't just bad grammar. This was humiliation waiting to happen. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. He cited a profit margin of 18%, but I'd seen the actual reports on his desk just 2 days ago. The real number was 12%. He was lying, either intentionally or because he didn't understand his own data. I put down the plate and walked to the doorway of the dining room. The presentation was still going. Felipe and his colleagues were exchanging glances, their body language screaming discomfort. Marcos, oblivious, continued talking, digging himself deeper with every sentence. My heart was pounding. I had 2 choices. I could stay silent, let him fail, and quietly enjoy the karma. Or I could risk everything, risk my job, risk his wrath, risk being seen. I thought about my mother selling her car, my father working double shifts, the years I'd spent invisible and underestimated, and I thought about the truth. The truth mattered more than my fear. I stepped into the room. "Excuse me." My voice was quiet but clear. Everyone turned to look at me. Marcus's face registered confusion, then irritation. "What is it?" I took a breath and said, in perfect English, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a significant error in your presentation." The room went silent. "You can't tell the investors you've captured 30% of the market share with an 18% profit margin when the actual figures are 22% market share and 12% profit margin. Also, it's we have captured, not we has, and a advantage should be an advantage." The projector hummed in the background. No one moved. Marcus's face turned red, then white. Brad looked like he was going to be sick. Philippe leaned back in his chair, one eyebrow raised, a slight smile playing at his lips. Marcus found his voice. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I met his eyes. "I'm correcting your mistakes before you lose $200 million. Philippe spoke, his accent thick but his English impeccable. "And who, may I ask, are you?" I turned to him. "My name is Maria Alejandra Restrepo. I have a degree in business administration and a master's in finance. I also speak 5 languages, including French, So I understood when you told your colleague earlier that Mr. Thornton seems desperate. You're right, he is. But the company he's trying to sell you on is actually worth investing in. If you look at the real numbers, not the ones he just presented. Philippe's smile widened. He said something in rapid French. Is that so? Tell me more. I responded in French, then switched to German when his colleague looked surprised, and finally to Portuguese when the third investor, who'd been silent all evening, lit up with recognition. For the next 20 minutes, I stood in that dining room and gave the presentation Marcus should have given. I pulled up the correct data on my phone, explained the actual market position, outlined a realistic growth strategy, and answered every question they threw at me with precision and confidence. Marcus stood frozen against the wall, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. Brad had disappeared entirely, probably hiding in the bathroom. When I finished, Philippe stood and extended his hand. Miss Restrepo, that was impressive. He turned to Marcus. We'll be in touch, Mr. Thornton, but I think we'll need Miss Restrepo involved in any future discussions. With that, they left. The silence after the door closed was deafening. Marcus stared at me like I'd just set his house on fire. His hands were shaking. Brad reappeared, pale and useless. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice low and dangerous. My office. Now. I followed him down the hall, my heart racing but my head clear. I'd crossed the line and there was no going back. He closed the door behind us and turned on me. Who the hell do you think you are? I stood my ground. Someone who just saved your deal. You humiliated me. You lied to investors. That's worse. He paced, running his hands through his hair. You're fired. Obviously. You're done. Pack your things and get out. I nodded. Fine. But you should know. Philippe Laurent just emailed you. Brad's phone chimed in the other room. Marcus grabbed his own phone from his desk and stared at the screen. His expression shifted from anger to confusion to something like disbelief. He read aloud. We're willing to move forward, but only if Miss Restrepo is directly involved in the operational oversight. We want her on the team. He looked up at me. What did you do? I told them the truth, I said simply. Something you should have done from the start. Hey, if you're still watching, thank you. I know this is intense, but trust me, the best part is coming. This is where everything changes. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now. You won't regret it. Marcus didn't fire me that night. He couldn't. Felipe had made his involvement in the deal contingent on my participation, and Marcus needed that money more than he needed his pride. But he didn't offer me a job either, not at first. Instead, we stood in his office in tense silence while he tried to process what had just happened. Finally, he said, What do you want? I didn't hesitate. A real position. Chief Financial Analyst. Market rate salary, not housekeeper wages. An office, not a broom closet, and respect. He laughed, but it was bitter. You think you can just walk in here and demand that? I already did, I said. And your investors agreed. He stared at me for a long moment, then sat down heavily in his chair. Fine. We'll draw up a contract. But don't think this means I trust you. I don't need you to trust me, I replied. I need you to pay me fairly and stay out of my way. The next few weeks were surreal. Marcus's lawyers drafted an employment contract that included a 6-figure salary, benefits, and a title that actually reflected my skills. I handed in my resignation to the housekeeping agency, and they were baffled. One of their cleaners was suddenly a corporate executive. It didn't make sense to them, but it made perfect sense to me. This was always who I was. I'd just been forced to hide it. My first day in the office, I walked through the front door of the building, not the service entrance. The receptionist looked confused when I introduced myself, then flustered when she realized I was the new analyst everyone had been talking about. Brad avoided me like I had a contagious disease. Marcus was cold and professional, which was fine. I wasn't there to make friends. The deal with Felipe closed 3 months later, and it was a massive success. I restructured the financials, identified cost-saving measures Marcus had overlooked, and presented a growth strategy that impressed even the most skeptical investors. Philippe called me directly to say, "You're the reason this worked. Don't let Marcos take credit." "I won't," I assured him. Word spread quickly in the industry. The press picked up the story. A feel-good piece about the Latina immigrant who went from housekeeper to executive. Some people loved it. Others were less kind. I received messages calling me an opportunist, saying I'd manipulated my way into a job I didn't deserve. But I also received messages from other women, other immigrants, thanking me for showing them it was possible. Marcus struggled with the new dynamic. He was used to being the smartest person in the room, the one everyone deferred to. Now, investors and colleagues came to me with questions, bypassing him entirely. It bruised his ego, and he made sure I knew it. In meetings, he'd undermine my suggestions, dismiss my analysis, try to reassert his dominance. But the numbers didn't lie, and eventually even he had to admit I knew what I was doing. 6 months into my new role, we were in a board meeting when Marcus tried to pitch a risky acquisition. I reviewed the financials and told him in front of everyone that it was a bad idea. The target company was overvalued, their debt was unmanageable, and the market conditions didn't support the investment. He insisted we move forward. I said, "If you do this, you'll lose everything you just gained." The board sided with me. Marcus was furious, but he backed down. 2 months later, the target company filed for bankruptcy. If we'd acquired them, we'd have gone down with them. That was the turning point. Marcus stopped fighting me and started listening. It wasn't respect, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement. I wasn't the help anymore. I was his safety net. Still, our relationship remained tense. He never apologized for the way he treated me, never acknowledged the years I spent scrubbing his floors while he insulted me under his breath. And I never forgot. I didn't need his apology. I had something better. I had proof that I was right all along. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was navigating the subtle and not so subtle discrimination that came with my new position. Colleagues questioned my credentials. Clients asked where I really went to school, as if my degrees were somehow less legitimate because they came from Columbia. At industry events, people assumed I was someone's assistant, not an executive in my own right. But I kept showing up, I kept proving myself. And slowly, grudgingly, I earned a reputation, not as Marcus Thornton's employee, but as Maria Alejandra Restrepo, the analyst who saved a $200 million deal and turned around a failing acquisition. I started getting offers from other firms, headhunters calling with opportunities that paid even more than I was making. I considered leaving, but something kept me at Marcus's company. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the satisfaction of watching him squirm every time I outperformed him. Or maybe it was because I knew that leaving would let him off the hook, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. One evening, almost a year after the dinner that changed everything, Marcus called me into his office. I expected another tense discussion about finances or strategy, but instead, he poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed me one. "Sit," he said. I sat, wary. He took a sip, looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline, and said, "I owe you an apology." I didn't respond, just waited. He continued, "I underestimated you. I dismissed you. I treated you like you were nothing, and I was wrong. You saved this company, you saved me, and I've been too proud to say it." I took a sip of the whiskey. It burned going down. "Why now? Why tell me this now?" "Because you're leaving," he said. "Aren't you?" I'd been thinking about it, but I hadn't made a decision. "How do you know?" He smiled, a real smile this time, not the arrogant smirk I was used to. "Because you're too smart to stay here forever. You've proven your point. You've built your reputation. There's nothing left for you to gain by staying." He wasn't wrong. But here's the thing. I didn't leave, not yet, because as much as Marcus had underestimated me, I'd underestimated something too, the power of visibility. By staying, I became a symbol. Other women, other immigrants, they saw me and believed that they could do it too. I started mentoring young Latinas trying to break into finance. I gave talks at colleges, sharing my story, encouraging students to pursue careers they thought were out of reach. And slowly, the company changed. Marcus hired more women, more people of color, not because he suddenly became enlightened, but because he realized that diversity wasn't just a buzzword, it was good business. The different perspectives, the varied experiences, they made us stronger, more innovative, more successful. Looking back now, I don't regret any of it. Not the years I spent cleaning floors, not the humiliation I endured, not even the moment I stepped into that dining room and risked everything. Because that moment taught me something invaluable. Your worth isn't determined by how others see you. It's determined by how you see yourself. And I've always known who I was, even when no one else did. Marcus and I have a complicated relationship now. We're not friends, but we're not enemies either. He respects me, and I've learned that even flawed people can grow. He still makes mistakes, still says things that make me cringe, but he listens now. And that's more than I ever expected from him. So what do you think? Did I make the right choice by staying and working for someone who humiliated me? Or should I have walked away and let it all fall apart? I really want to know what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about your own worth and your own voice, please subscribe to this channel. There are so many more stories like this. Stories of resilience, of justice, of people who refuse to stay invisible. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for listening to my story. It means more than you know.